The elegant chandeliers sparkled above the crowded dining room, casting a warm glow over the pristine white tablecloths. The hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the soft notes of a grand piano filled the air. This was no ordinary restaurant. It was one of the most exclusive fine dining spots in the city, a place where only the wealthiest and most influential people dined. Tonight, among the guests, was a man who needed no introduction, Donald Trump. But as he walked in, dressed in a sharp suit, there was no grand announcement, no red carpet rolled out. He simply took a seat at his reserved table, unnoticed by most. The restaurant's staff had seen all kinds of celebrities and high-profile guests, but to one particular waiter, Trump was just another rich businessman, and not one he admired. From the moment he approached the table, his attitude was different, curt, dismissive, almost rude. Instead of the warm, professional service the restaurant was known for, the waiter barely made eye contact. His tone was sharp, his patience thin. He rolled his eyes when Trump made a simple request, muttered under his breath, and made it clear he wasn't a fan. Trump, however, remained calm. He didn't react to the waiter's behavior, didn't demand immediate respect, didn't even hint at who he really was. He simply observed. The waiter had no idea that the very man he was disrespecting wasn't just another guest. He was the owner of the restaurant itself. The staff around them exchanged nervous glances, recognizing Trump but unsure if he would call out the waiter's behavior. Would he let it slide? Would he speak up? The tension in the air was thick, but the waiter remained clueless, convinced he was dealing with just another wealthy customer. Then, just as the waiter turned away with an exasperated sigh, Trump leaned back in his chair and spoke, calmly, but with authority. What he said next would change everything in an instant. Trump slowly folded his hands on the table, his expression unreadable. The waiter, still oblivious, barely acknowledged him before hurrying off to another table. A few of the other staff members whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Trump and the waiter. Some of them knew who Trump was. How could they not? But no one dared to interfere. They watched in silent anticipation, wondering how long it would take before the waiter realized his mistake. A few minutes later, the waiter returned, holding a glass of water with a careless grip, setting it down with just a little too much force. A few drops splashed onto the tablecloth, but he didn't apologize. Instead, he exhaled sharply, as if serving Trump was an inconvenience. "Are you ready to order or not?" he asked, his tone bordering on impatience. Trump studied him for a moment, still calm, still composed. "What do you recommend?" he asked, his voice even. The waiter smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Depends. You looking for something overpriced or just something edible?" He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "This place is all about fancy names and big bills. If you want real food, there's a diner down the street." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The waiter shrugged. "I just work here. I know how these places run. Rich folks come in, drop a fortune on a steak, and pretend it's the best meal they've ever had. But hey, if you want to waste your money, be my guest." Around the room, a few guests shifted uncomfortably, overhearing the exchange. The manager, standing near the bar, stiffened but didn't step in. He seemed unsure whether to intervene or let the situation unfold. Trump didn't look offended. In fact, there was almost a hint of amusement in his eyes. He glanced around the restaurant, taking in the expensive decor, the polished floors, the crystal glasses that caught the light just right. Then he looked back at the waiter. "Sounds like you have some strong opinions about this place," he said, his tone still unreadable. The waiter scoffed. "Trust me, if you knew how this business really worked, you'd think twice before eating here." A small smile played on Trump's lips. "Oh, I know exactly how it works," he said smoothly. "Better than you do." The waiter frowned, confused. But before he could respond, Trump leaned forward slightly, ready to drop the words that would turn the entire situation upside down. The waiter's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly masked his confusion with a scoff. Yeah, and how's that? He challenged, folding his arms. His tone dripped with sarcasm, as if he was humoring some out-of-touch businessman who thought he understood the restaurant world. Trump didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of water, as if considering his words carefully. The tension at the table thickened. A few diners nearby had fallen silent, their curiosity piqued by the unusual exchange. Even the bartender had stopped mid-pour, his eyes flicking toward the scene unfolding before him. The waiter shifted his weight, starting to feel uneasy under Trump's steady gaze. "Look, if you don't like my service, you can ask for someone else," he said, glancing around, expecting some backup. But none of his co-workers moved. The other staff members looked torn between stepping in and staying out of it. They knew something the waiter didn't, and their silence only made his discomfort grow. Trump finally set his glass down, the sound of it meeting the table somehow feeling deliberate. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm but firm, "how long have you worked here?" The waiter huffed. "Couple of months." "Why?" Trump nodded slightly. "And in those couple of months, you've figured out how this whole place runs." "More than you, I'm guessing." The waiter crossed his arms again, his confidence creeping back. He was determined not to be rattled by this customer, no matter how intense he seemed. "I see what happens behind the scenes. The overpriced menu, the ridiculous dress code, the way the big shots walk in here like they own the place." He chuckled, shaking his head. "They throw around money like it means something, like it makes them better than the rest of us." Trump studied him for a long moment before responding. "And what about the people who actually own the place?" The waiter frowned, confused by the question. "What about them?" Trump tilted his head slightly. "Do you think they care about this restaurant?" The waiter snorted. "Please, places like this, it's all business. Rich guys buy them just to show off, to have another spot to bring their friends. They don't actually know what it's like to work in one." He gestured around vaguely. "Trust me, whoever owns this place probably hasn't stepped foot in the kitchen once." Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Interesting," he said simply. The waiter furrowed his brow. There was something strange about the way this man was handling the conversation. Most guests who had a problem with service would either complain or just ignore it, but this guy, he was different. He wasn't angry, wasn't flustered. He was just watching, studying. It was unsettling. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager had inched closer, his face pale, his hands nervously adjusting his tie. He opened his mouth as if to intervene but hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. He knew the truth. He knew that with one sentence, Trump could flip the entire restaurant upside down. But Trump hadn't done it yet. He was waiting. The waiter, still oblivious, let out a short laugh. "You really think you know this business better than me?" Trump smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. "I know it better than you think." The waiter rolled his eyes. "All right then, since you know so much, why didn't you tell me? What would you do differently if you ran this place?" His voice was dripping with sarcasm, as if daring Trump to answer. Trump didn't break eye contact. He let the question sit in the air for a moment before finally saying, "I wouldn't change much. After all, I built it exactly the way I wanted." Silence. For the first time that night, the waiter hesitated. The smirk on his face wavered. A couple of guests at nearby tables exchanged glances, whispers passing between them. The tension in the room had shifted, and now all eyes were on Trump. The waiter blinked, his confidence cracking. "Wait, what?" Trump didn't say another word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small gold-embossed business card, and placed it gently on the table. The waiter stared at it, his breath catching slightly as he read the name printed across the front. The name that suddenly made everything fall into place. The name that sent a chill down his spine. Donald J. Trump, owner. His heart pounded, his mind raced, and for the first time that evening, he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. The waiter's face drained of color as he stared at the card. His fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't dare pick it up. It felt like a trap, like the moment he touched it, everything would become real. His eyes flicked back up to Trump, who was watching him with that same calm, unreadable expression. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. All around the restaurant, people had caught on to what was happening. Some whispered quietly, others just watched, their gazes darting between Trump and the now visibly nervous waiter. The staff, who had remained frozen on the sidelines, exchanged glances, waiting for what would happen next. Even the manager, who had been slowly inching forward, stopped in his tracks, holding his breath. The waiter swallowed hard. His confidence, his sarcasm, the smug way he had carried himself all night, it was gone. He suddenly felt small, standing there in front of the man he had just insulted, the man who owned everything around him. Trump tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with an edge. The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was scrambling, trying to figure out how to get out of this, how to salvage what was left of his dignity. He let out a nervous chuckle, though it sounded more like a shaky breath. I didn't know." Trump raised an eyebrow. Didn't know what? The waiter hesitated, his throat dry. He felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, feel the sweat starting to creep along his hairline. He wanted to look away, to break eye contact, but he couldn't. Trump leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the space between them feel smaller. "Didn't know who you were talking to." The waiter swallowed again, nodding quickly. "Yeah, I had no idea." Trump nodded slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of those words settle. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. "Because you were pretty confident a few minutes ago." The waiter's stomach twisted. He could hear the murmurs growing louder around the restaurant, feel the tension growing thicker. He wanted to disappear, to slip away before the situation got any worse, but it was too late for that. He had already walked too far down this road. Then, just when the silence became unbearable, Trump exhaled softly, shaking his head. "You know," he said, his voice still calm but firm, "I've met a lot of people like you." The waiter flinched slightly. "Like me?" Trump nodded. "People who think they have everything figured out, who assume they know the game just because they've seen a few moves." He leaned back again, his gaze steady. "But here's the thing, you never really know who you're dealing with." The words hit hard, and the waiter felt his knees go weak. He knew he had made a mistake, a big one, but he didn't know what was coming next. Was he about to be fired? Humiliated in front of the entire restaurant? The suspense was unbearable. The manager finally took a step forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his face pale. "Mr. Trump, I." Trump held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. He wasn't finished yet. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Trump turned his attention back to the waiter. The moment of truth was coming, and no one knew exactly how it would play out. The waiter braced himself, his heart pounding in his chest. Then Trump spoke, and in that instant, everything changed. Trump tapped his fingers on the table once, a small but deliberate movement that sent another wave of tension through the air. The waiter was barely breathing at this point, his mind racing for an escape, but none existed. Every person in the room was locked onto them, waiting for what Trump would do next. Then, just when it seemed like the moment had reached its peak, Trump did something completely unexpected. He chuckled. It wasn't a forced or mocking laugh, but a genuine, amused chuckle, as if he had just heard a joke that no one else in the room understood. The waiter blinked, caught off guard. He had expected anger, a demand to be fired, maybe even a public reprimand. But laughter, that threw him completely off balance. Trump leaned back in his chair, still smiling slightly. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "I've had worse service." The room remained dead silent. The waiter wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Was Trump downplaying everything? Was he toying with him? The manager, still standing stiffly a few feet away, let out a nervous breath. "Mr. Trump, I sincerely apologize for—" Trump waved him off. "I'm not done yet." The manager snapped his mouth shut, stepping back like a soldier given an order. The waiter swallowed hard. Trump turned his attention fully back to him. "You don't like this place," he stated, his tone almost casual. "That's obvious." The waiter's mouth felt dry. He knew better than to say anything, but something in Trump's gaze told him to answer. "It's just," he hesitated. "It's not personal. I've seen how these places work." Trump nodded as if he understood. "You think the customers here are just paying for status. You think the food isn't worth the price. And you think the owner doesn't care." The waiter shifted uncomfortably. When Trump said it out loud like that, it sounded much worse. "I mean, yeah," he admitted reluctantly. Trump smirked. "That's interesting," he said, pausing for effect. "Because I built this restaurant for a reason, and it wasn't just about money." The waiter frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Trump glanced around the restaurant, his eyes sweeping over the elegant chandeliers, the perfectly set tables, the well-dressed diners. "You see a place for the wealthy," he said. "But what you don't see is the people who made this possible, the chefs in the kitchen who trained for years, the servers who work hard to make sure every guest gets an experience, not just a meal, the suppliers who bring in the best ingredients." He looked back at the waiter. "This isn't just some rich man's playground. It's a business that supports real people." The waiter had no response. For the first time that night, he felt something else besides fear, guilt. Then Trump leaned forward again, his expression sharp. "And you, my friend, just insulted every single one of them." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The waiter's stomach twisted, and he instinctively looked around. He saw the kitchen staff peeking from the doorway, the bartenders watching closely, the other servers standing frozen, their expressions unreadable. He had thought he was just speaking against the wealthy guests, but now he realized he had put down the very people who worked alongside him. Trump didn't let up. "You think I don't care? I care more than you know. I built this restaurant from the ground up. I know what it takes to make it work. And you," he gestured toward the waiter, "you walked in here, convinced you have everything figured out, without understanding the first thing about what goes on behind the scenes." The waiter's chest tightened. He had messed up, badly. Then Trump sat back, crossing his arms. "So tell me," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What should I do with you?" The entire restaurant held its breath. The waiter could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. And then, before he could even begin to answer, another voice spoke up from across the room. "I think I have an idea." Heads turned. "You wanted to know what it's like to run a place like this." His voice was steady, controlled. "Well, here's your chance to find out." The inspector nodded. "I think it would be a good idea to start with the staff." He turned to the manager. "We'll be having a talk shortly." The manager gave a stiff nod, sweat beading at his temple. Then the inspector faced the waiter again. "And you," he said, his voice sharper now. "I'd like to hear more about your experience working here." His tone carried a weight that made it clear. This wasn't just about an employee with a bad attitude. This was bigger. The waiter's heart pounded. What had started as a simple act of arrogance had now spiraled into something beyond his control. He had thought he was just dealing with an unhappy customer, but that customer had turned out to be the owner of the entire place. And now, standing before him, was a man who had the power to turn his mistake into something much, much worse. Trump picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, completely at ease. "Well," he said, setting it back down with a satisfied nod, "this just got interesting." The waiter clenched his fists, his stomach in knots. He had spent a whole night thinking he had the upper hand. Now, for the first time, he realized he had never been in control at all. The waiter's throat felt tight as he stood there, unsure of what to say. His arrogance had led him straight into a situation he never could have anticipated. He had disrespected a man without realizing he was the owner, and now, With an inspector in front of him and every eye in the restaurant watching, he could feel the weight of his actions crushing down on him. Trump, still completely composed, glanced at the inspector. "Well, I guess this is where we see how well my restaurant is really being run." The inspector nodded. "I'll be speaking with the staff and taking a closer look at things.